Railroad Tycoon offered land to settlers, but buried their bodies beneath it. He promised them paradise for $20 an acre, but the only thing growing in that soil was the bones of the families who came before them. The dust rose like prayers from the crowd gathered outside Millfield's only hotel, swirling around the polished boots of Cornelius Harwick as he stepped onto the makeshift platform. His silver watch chain caught the afternoon sun, throwing tiny rainbows across the faces of desperate families who had traveled hundreds of miles to hear his words. Children clung to their mothers' worn skirts, while fathers clutched crumpled newspaper advertisements that had drawn them here like moths to flame. Harwick's voice rolled across the assembly like honey over bread, sweet and rich with promise. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you today not as a businessman, but as a shepherd leading his flock to greener pastures. His arms swept wide, encompassing the endless blue sky above them. Beyond those mountains lies Eden itself, 20,000 acres of the most fertile land God ever breathed life into. Soil so rich you can smell the harvest before you plant the seed. Mary Henderson shifted her baby closer to her chest, feeling the familiar hollow ache in her stomach. Beside her, her husband John's weathered hands traced the edges of their last $5 bill. 3 failed crops had brought them here, to this moment, to this man who spoke of soil like it was salvation. Now, I know what you're thinking, Harwick continued, his gray eyes scanning the crowd with practiced precision. You've heard promises before. You've been sold dreams that turned to dust in your hands. A murmur rippled through the assembly. But I'm not selling you dreams, friends. I'm offering you destiny. He pulled out a leather portfolio, thick with official-looking documents. These deeds in my hand represent more than land. They represent legacy. A chance for your children to grow up with dirt under their fingernails that belongs to them. Not some Eastern bank or railroad company that's never seen a sunset from a porch they built with their own hands. Old Pete Kowalski, who had buried 2 sons in the war and watched his farm die in the drought, felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Hope was a dangerous thing for a man his age, but crept in anyway, warm and unwelcome. The railroad magnate's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every ear. New Haven, we're calling it. A town where the schoolhouse will ring with children's laughter, where the general store will know your name, where Sunday services will thank the Lord for his abundance. He paused, letting the silence stretch like taffy. $20 an acre, friends. The price of a few bottles of whiskey for land that will feed your families for generations. Behind Harwick, his foreman Clay Maddox stood in the shadow of the hotel's overhang, his black hat pulled low over features that seemed carved from granite. While his boss painted pictures with words, Clay's eyes counted heads, calculated wagon capacity, measured the strength in the shoulders of the men who would be digging their own graves. The crowd pressed forward as Harwick began laying out deeds on a folding table. Names were called, hands shaken, money exchanged for promises written on parchment that smelled of leather and possibility. The Henderson family stepped forward, John's calloused palm warm and damp as it met Harwick's manicured hand. You're making the right choice, Mr. Henderson, the Tycoon said, his smile bright as new silver. Your boy there will thank you when he's grown, standing on land that his children will inherit. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the first wagons were already being loaded. Families who had owned nothing but debt and desperation now clutched deeds to paradise, their faces bright with the fever of new beginnings. The oxen lowed softly, sensing the journey ahead, while children ran between the wheels, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Harwick watched from his private rail car as the wagon train formed up, his reflection ghost-like in the polished window. His ledger lay open beside him, columns of numbers that told a different story than the one he'd shared with the crowd. $20 an acre for land that existed only in his imagination, multiplied by the number of graves his men would dig in the alkali waste beyond the mountains. Clay Maddox knocked once on the doorframe before entering. They'll reach the site in 4 days, boss. Just like the others. Good, Harwick replied, not turning from the window. Make sure the shovels are sharp this time. The ground out there is harder than hell's own floor. The wagon train pulled out as the first stars appeared, wheels creaking a rhythm that sounded almost like music. Behind them, Millfield settled into evening quiet, while ahead lay the promise of New Haven, a town that would never exist on land that would never bloom, for people who would never see another sunrise. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something that tasted of copper and regret, drifting down from the mountains like a warning that no one was listening for. For days later, when the wagons finally stopped rolling, the silence would be so complete that even the children would sense something wrong in the air, something that made the horses stamp and the oxen refuse to graze, as if the very earth beneath their feet held secrets too terrible for the living to bear. The surveyor's compass kept spinning in circles, and when he knelt down to check the ground beneath his feet, his fingers found something that no map had ever marked. Thomas McKenna had been riding for 3 days when he first smelled it, a sweetness in the desert air that didn't belong, like flowers blooming in a graveyard. His mare, Belle, had been growing more restless with each mile, her ears flicking back and forth as if listening to whispers only she could hear. When the wind shifted, bringing that strange scent stronger now, she stopped altogether and refused to move another step. The young surveyor dismounted and pulled his instruments from the saddlebags, the brass compass and measuring chains that had guided him across half the territories. Harwick's telegram had been specific: survey the New Haven settlement site, prepare plots for the incoming families, ensure everything was ready for their arrival. Easy work for good pay, the kind that let a man save enough to buy his own spread someday. But there was no settlement here. No town, no buildings, no sign that human hands had ever touched this stretch of alkali flats. Just the skeletal remains of sagebrush poking through cracked earth that looked like it hadn't seen rain in a decade. Thomas pulled out the map Harwick had given him, its crisp lines and careful notations promising fertile river bottom and natural springs. The compass needle spun lazily in its housing, as if the very ground beneath his feet was confusing its sense of direction. He knelt and scooped up a handful of the pale soil. It was wrong somehow, too soft, too yielding, like flour that had been sifted and re-sifted until it lost all substance. And there was that smell again, stronger now, making his stomach turn over on itself. Belle whinnied nervously behind him, pawing at the ground with her front hooves. "Easy, girl," Thomas murmured, but his own voice sounded thin in the vast silence. "Just dirt and wind. Nothing more." He began pacing off the plots as Harwick had instructed, driving wooden stakes into the earth to mark property lines. The first stake went in easy, too easy, sinking into the ground like it was pushing through loose sand instead of desert hardpan. When he pulled it back out, something dark clung to the pointed end. Fabric, he thought at first, until he looked closer and saw the weathered remnants of a child's dress, tiny flowers still visible on the faded cloth. Thomas's hands began to shake as he stared at the scrap of material. He told himself it could be anything: old rags blown here by the wind, trash left by passing travelers. But when he drove the second stake in the ground, it struck something solid with a dull thunk that seemed to echo up from deep below. He worked the stake back and forth, loosening whatever lay beneath, until the earth gave way and something white rolled free. A skull, small and delicate, with empty sockets that seemed to stare accusingly at the cloudless sky. The surveyor fell backward, his breath coming in sharp gasps that tasted of alkali and death. Around him, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, but now every shadow seemed to hide secrets. Every depression in the earth marked another grave. He understood now why Belle had refused to go further, why his compass spun uselessly, why the very air felt thick with unspoken sorrows. With trembling hands, Thomas began to dig. Not with his surveying tools, but with his bare fingers, clawing at the soft earth until his nails split and bled. More bones emerged, ribs that had once protected beating hearts, finger bones that had once held children's hands, fragments of lives cut short and buried in unmarked graves. A wedding ring caught the afternoon sun, its simple gold band inscribed with words of love that would never be spoken again. A wooden horse, carved with the patient care of father's hands, lay beside the small bones of the child who had treasured it. The truth hit him like a physical blow. The families who had come before, the settlers who had answered Harwick's call, just as the Henderson family and old Pete Kowalski were doing now. They hadn't found paradise. They had found death, quick and brutal, their dreams buried in alkali soil while their money lined the railroad baron's pockets. Thomas stumbled back to his horse, his mind reeling with the horror of discovery. In his saddlebags lay Harwick's letters, cheerful missives about the prosperity awaiting the new arrivals, instructions for preparing the land for their fresh start. The same lies he had told to the families, now moldering beneath Thomas's boots. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Thomas loaded the evidence into his saddlebags, Bones wrapped carefully in his spare shirt, the child's toy, the wedding ring that still held traces of love in its worn gold. Behind him, the alkali flats stretched away like a vast cemetery, each depression marking another family's final resting place. The wind picked up, whistling through the sage and carrying voices that only the dead could hear. Belle turned willingly away from that cursed ground, her hooves finding solid purchase on the desert stone beyond the killing field. But Thomas knew that no matter how far they rode, he would never escape the weight of what he had discovered, never stop seeing those empty sockets staring up at him from their unmarked graves. Miles away, smoke rose from the chimney of another railroad town, where families were loading wagons and dreaming of better days ahead, unaware that their promised land was nothing more than a potter's field dressed up in lies and sealed with blood. By the time Thomas reached the nearest telegraph station, his hands were steady again, but his heart carried a new kind of weight. The knowledge that some truths are too heavy for one man to bear alone, and that justice sometimes demands a reckoning that will shake the very foundations of an empire built on bones. When a young surveyor burst in the railroad car with a bag full of bones, the Tycoon didn't even look up from his brandy. He just smiled and asked if Thomas preferred to dig his own grave or let the professionals handle it. The oil lamps in Harwick's private railroad car cast dancing shadows across mahogany walls as Thomas McKenna climbed the brass steps, his saddlebags heavy with evidence that felt like carrying the weight of the dead themselves. Through the windows, he could see the lights of Cedar Ridge flickering in the distance, another town where families were probably dreaming of better tomorrows while counting their last coins. Cornelius Harwick sat behind a desk that gleamed like black water, a crystal decanter of brandy at his elbow, and ledger books spread before him like a feast of numbers. He didn't look up when Thomas entered, didn't acknowledge the young man's presence until the surveyor emptied his saddlebags onto the Persian carpet with a sound like rattling dice. Bones scattered across the rich fabric, small ones that had belonged to children, larger ones from men and women who had trusted in promises that turned to dust. The wooden horse rolled against Harwick's polished boot, its painted eyes staring up at the railroad baron with silent accusation. "Ah, Mr. McKenna," Harwick said, finally raising his eyes from his books. "I trust your survey of New Haven went well. I do hope the site meets with your professional approval." Thomas's voice came out as a croak, his throat dry as the alkali flats he'd fled from. "You murdered them. All of them. Families, children. How many wagon trains have you sent to that godforsaken place?" "Murder." Harwick swirled his brandy, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. "Such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as land management. Supply and demand, Mr. McKenna. There's always more demand for paradise than there is supply." The railroad car swayed gently on its tracks, a motion that should have been soothing, but instead made Thomas feel seasick with horror. The Hendersons, old Pete, all those families in Millfield, they're riding toward their deaths right now because of your lies. Their deaths. Harwick stood and walked to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. "No, Mr. McKenna. They're investments. $20 an acre for prime real estate. even if that real estate happens to be 6 feet deep. They're contributing to the railroad's expansion, helping to build America's future. There's nobility in that sacrifice, don't you think? Thomas reached for the Colt on his hip, but his hand froze when he heard the distinct sound of a rifle being cocked behind him. Clay Maddox stepped out of the shadows like death itself, his black eyes fixed on the surveyor with the patience of a man who had killed before and would kill again. Now, Harwick continued, returning to his desk and pouring another glass of brandy. Violence won't solve anything. Besides, you're missing the bigger picture here. Do you know how much it costs to buy judges, sheriffs, newspaper editors? More than you'll make in 10 lifetimes of honest surveying work. This little business venture finances operations from Sacramento to St. Louis. Law and order, Mr. McKenna. Civilization itself runs on railroad money. Civilization built on murder, Thomas whispered, his hand still hovering near his gun. Built on sacrifice, Harwick corrected. The same sacrifice that cleared the Indians from these lands, that pushed the frontier ever westward, that turned wilderness into cities. A few dozen families are a small price to pay for progress. Clay Maddox stepped closer, his rifle now aimed directly at Thomas's chest. Should I handle this, boss? Same as the others. Not quite yet, Harwick replied, studying Thomas like a specimen under glass. Mr. McKenna here has a choice to make. He can ride out of here tonight, forget what he's seen, and continue his surveying work with a significant bonus for his discretion. Or he can join his discoveries out there in the alkali flats, where the ground is always hungry for more. Thomas looked down at the bones scattered at his feet, at the child's toy that would never again bring laughter to small hands. In his mind, he could hear the voices of the dead. Mary Henderson's baby crying for milk that would never come, old Pete's prayers for land that would never bloom, the whispered last words of families who had believed in dreams that turned to nightmares. There's a third choice, Thomas said, his voice stronger now, fed by a rage that burned brighter than fear. I ride out of here and tell everyone who'll listen about what you've done. Every town between here and the Mississippi will know your name and what it means. Harwick's laugh was soft as silk and twice as dangerous. Tell whom exactly? Sheriff Brooks in Cedar Ridge? He owes his badge to railroad money. Judge Patterson in the county seat? His courthouse was built with railroad funds. The territorial governor himself dines at my table twice a month. He leaned forward, his gray eyes reflecting the lamplight like coins on a dead man's face. There is no authority in this territory that doesn't answer to me, Mr. McKenna. No law that isn't written in railroad ink. But Thomas was already backing toward the door, his hand finally closing on his gun. Maybe not in this territory. But the railroad doesn't own everything west of the Missouri, and truth has a way of traveling faster than trains when it needs to. The crack of Clay's rifle shattered the night air, but Thomas was already diving through the doorway, glass from the window exploding around him as he rolled off the platform and into the darkness beyond. Behind him, he could hear Harwick shouting orders, the sound of boots on gravel, the whinnying of horses being saddled for pursuit. Thomas reached Bell and vaulted into the saddle, his saddlebags now empty of bones, but heavy with purpose. The mare needed no encouragement to run, her hooves striking sparks from the railroad ties as they fled into the desert night. Behind them, torches began to flicker like angry stars, and the sound of pursuit grew louder with each passing moment. As they crested the first ridge, Thomas looked back to see the lights of Harwick's train growing smaller in the distance. But he knew the railroad baron's reach was long, his influence vast, his hunger for silence absolute. The desert stretched ahead like an ocean of darkness, offering hiding places among its rocks and canyons, but also promising death to those who couldn't find water or shelter. The wind carried voices now, not the dead this time, but the living, the families still traveling toward New Haven with hope in their hearts and trust in their souls. Thomas kicked Bell into a harder gallop, racing against time and greed and the terrible weight of truth that only one man in all the territory seemed willing to carry. 3 days of hard riding later, when Thomas finally saw the smoke rising from a town too small to appear on railroad maps, he wondered if salvation could come from the most unlikely places, and whether the voice of one honest man might somehow speak louder than all the gold that bought silence in the shadows. The widow had buried 3 sons and a husband, but when the broken surveyor stumbled into her newspaper office with a story that could topple an empire, she picked up her pen like it was a loaded gun. Sarah Blackwood was setting type for Tuesday's edition of the Copper Falls Gazette when Thomas McKenna collapsed through her door like a man fleeing the very hounds of hell. 3 days of desert sun had burned his face to leather, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much truth for one soul to carry. She caught him as he stumbled, her ink-stained hands steady from years of holding up things that threatened to fall. "Water," he whispered, and she helped him to the chair beside her printing press, the same chair where miners came to place advertisements for lost mules and mothers came to announce their daughters' weddings. But this man carried something heavier than want ads or social news. She could see it in the way his shoulders sagged, as if gravity itself had doubled its hold on him. She brought him a tin cup from the well out back, watched him drink like a man who had forgotten what water tasted like. Only when color returned to his cracked lips did she speak. "I'm Sarah Blackwood, editor of this paper. And you are?" "Thomas McKenna." His voice was raw as sandpaper. "I need to tell someone what I've seen. Someone who might listen, might believe." He looked around the small office, at the hand-operated press, the neat stacks of paper, the headlines from the previous week announcing a church social and the birth of twins to the banker's wife. Someone who isn't afraid of the railroad. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had heard whispers, rumors that traveled the mountain passes like smoke on the wind. Stories of families who had headed west with high hopes and were never heard from again. What railroad? Harwick's line. Cornelius Harwick. Thomas reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded paper, stained with sweat and desert dust. "He's been selling land to settlers, land that doesn't exist except as a killing ground. Families pay him their life savings for deeds to paradise, then disappear into alkali flats that serve as their graves." The editor's hands went still on the typesetting tray. She knew that name, had seen it on legal notices and land grants that came through on the Territorial Telegraph. But more than that, she knew the particular weight of loss that Thomas carried, recognized it like a sister recognizes her own reflection. "How many families?" she asked quietly. "I don't know. Dozens, maybe more. I found bones, Mrs. Blackwood. Children's bones mixed with their parents, all buried in unmarked graves while Harwick counts his blood money." Thomas's voice broke like a boy's. "There's another wagon train heading there right now. The Hendersons, old Pete Kowalski, families with babies who will never see their first birthday unless someone stops this." Sarah moved to her desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and dipped her pen in ink that seemed black as justice itself. "Tell me everything. Every detail, every name, every lie he told. And don't leave out how you got away. Readers need to understand what kind of monster we're dealing with." For the next 3 hours, Thomas spoke and Sarah wrote, her pen scratching across page after page as the terrible story unfolded. She asked questions like a prosecutor, demanded specifics like a judge, and when he finished, she had enough words to fill the front page, and then some. "This will destroy him," she said, reading back through her notes. "But only if people read it, if they believe it. Harwick's got money enough to buy silence from here to Sacramento. But not from you." Sarah's laugh was bitter as winter coffee. "My husband and 3 sons went to work his railroad 5 years ago. Cave in on the Horseshoe Bend Tunnel," he said. "Act of God," he said. $20 compensation for each life," he said. She set down her pen and looked Thomas in the eyes. "I've been waiting 5 years for a chance to plant words that would grow into justice. You just brought me the seeds." She worked through the night, setting type by lamplight while Thomas slept fitfully in the chair, his dreams haunted by voices that would never speak again. By dawn, she had the story ready. Headlines that screamed the truth across 2 columns, details that would make readers' blood run cold, and a call to action that would shake the territory awake. But Sarah Blackwood understood that one small-town newspaper wasn't enough to topple an empire built on rails and watered with blood. Before the sun cleared the mountain peaks, she was at the telegraph office, sending copies of the story to every paper from Denver to Portland, every editor who might have the courage to run it. The telegrapher, a nervous man named Willie who owed his job to railroad money, tried to refuse the messages. "Can't send lies over the wire, Mrs. Blackwood. It's against regulations." Sarah placed a gold piece on his counter, one of the few her husband had left her. "Then it's lucky these aren't lies, Willie. Just words that need wings to carry them where they'll do the most good." By noon, the story was spreading faster than wildfire in a drought year. Papers in mining camps and cattle towns picked it up, editors added their own investigations, and suddenly Harwick's name was being spoken in saloons and churches with equal parts disgust and rage. The territorial governor, who had dined at the railroad baron's table just the week before, found himself facing crowds demanding answers. Sheriffs who had looked the other way were voted out of office or simply ran for the hills. Thomas stood at the window of a newspaper office, watching riders gallop out of town in all directions, carrying copies of the Gazette to places where telegraph lines didn't reach. "Will it be enough?" he asked. "Truth is like water," Sarah replied, cleaning ink from her hands. "Find one crack in the dam, and eventually the whole thing comes down." She looked out at the dusty street where people were gathering in small groups, talking in voices filled with anger and purpose. And sometimes, when enough people know the truth at the same time, justice doesn't wait for courts and judges. That evening, word came by telegraph that a federal marshal was riding hard for Cedar Ridge, armed with warrants and the backing of newspapers from coast to coast. 2 days later, another message reported that Cornelius Harwick had been found dead in his private railroad car, a single bullet through the heart and a note pinned to his vest that read, "For the children who will never grow up." The Alkali Flats, where New Haven was supposed to bloom, became something else entirely. Families came from across the territory to plant wildflowers on the unmarked graves, and somehow, in soil that had seemed too poisoned for anything to grow, those flowers took root. Each spring they returned, painting the desert in colors that spoke of memory and hope, of lives that had ended too soon but were not forgotten. Thomas McKenna stayed on as surveyor for the territorial government, but his real job became something else. Guardian of a sacred place where truth had finally taken root in ground watered by tears and tended by those who remembered that some stories are too important to let die with the telling. Years later, travelers passing through that stretch of desert would stop to wonder at the flowers that bloomed where nothing should have grown, never knowing they stood on ground made sacred by the simple act of one woman choosing her pen over silence, and the seeds of justice that can sprout in the most unlikely places when tended by hands that refuse to forget.